Joined Wallop Preparatory School, and we went to the Veterans Hospital and shook the hands of bedridden veterans and promised them, by giving them cards of cheer, that we would not in any way cut their benefits.
Would the gentleman suspend for a moment, please? The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed to the conference report accompanying H.R. 2112, cited as the Consolidated and Further Continuing Appropriations Act, 2012.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
And I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman from Illinois in just a moment for finishing this point, and be happy to yield to the gentleman. These cuts will result in draconian cuts, or worse than the Ryan House GOP budget. It opens the doors, the gentleman may comment on this, to courts to intervene in federal budget decisions by placing the balanced budget requirement into the Constitution. It will generate enormous, in fact, there will be a line to the courthouse on constitutional challenges on cutting Pell Grants and cutting food stamps and cutting housing and cutting veterans benefits, as I said. And then, of course, more than 270 organizations representing people that are the most vulnerable have begged us to unshackle the steel anvils from our legs and arms and do the people's business. I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
I wanted to ask the gentlelady a question because I think she touched upon a thoughtful comment in her remarks. I mean, I can imagine, since every member of Congress and every candidate for Congress is running for office and they run to uphold the Constitution of the United States, they swear to uphold the Constitution and its various provisions within the context of the debate that we have here on the floor of the Congress. In my district, I run on a campaign to try and provide better housing for my constituents. I run a campaign trying to provide health care for the health careless, those who don't have health care. I run trying to say that the federal government has an obligation to address issues of unemployment and provide jobs, and when the private sector won't invest its money in and on the south side of Chicago, that it should do more. I run my campaigns arguing that people should get involved in the political process because if they vote for me, I can provide them some hope. I'll come to the floor of the Congress and have their grievances redressed by the government of the United States. Under the balanced budget amendment as proposed by the gentleman from Virginia, it seems to me that anyone running for Congress in the future isn't going to be running making promises or commitments to do anything about the social ills or the gaps that exists within our society. They'll be running for office saying, what I guarantee is you cannot have better housing, that you cannot concern yourself about the federal government's role in health care, or that the federal government should have no role in addressing issues of unemployment. Let the private sector work its way to the south side of Chicago or to Houston, Texas. The gentlelady's argument seems to suggest that the balanced budget amendment itself changes the framework and the structure of America, and instead of candidates running for office making the case for hope and making the case for change and encouraging the promise of America, it's just the opposite. Will the gentlelady comment on that, please?
Well, the gentleman is eloquent in his analysis, and as an appropriator, the gentleman knows full well the value of regular order. And that is that the voices of not only the appropriators, meaning those on the Appropriations Committee, but other members are able to, in essence, craft the ultimate appropriations, maybe working with a budget, maybe not, based upon the current needs of the American people. The balanced budget amendment will stand not as a guard at the door of the United States Congress. The doors are to my left. We come in and out. It will literally be a lock and chain on the door, because it will say to those who are running for office, in essence, you are powerless. You will either be, as other litigants in the courthouse, in the third branch of government, seeking refuge for your constituents, or you will make at being a member of Congress and spend most of your time fighting the balanced budget amendment in the courts. The gentleman is absolutely correct. And I would add to this that even though they make a way for disasters and wars, even if it is presumed to be under the jurisdiction of the President's executive powers, to even expend any dollars, one would have to come to this body to receive a majority vote by the House, a majority vote by the other House. And that means that all branches of government will be under this lock. The President will not be able to act as a President. The Congress will have disagreement as to whether or not it's a war we support or a conflict we support or an emergency we support. And in essence, the gentleman's very fine point, and as I indicated, we will be clogging the federal courts on each iota of disagreement, dealing with from vast issues of protecting the homeland to the necessity of defending the principles of democracy around the world. And I know there are some probably listening and they're probably applauding because they said, I don't want to help anyone anyhow, but some of that help falls back on the safety and security of the American people. What is going on in Somalia, the frightening devastation of death that we're not acknowledging, might be a cause for the support of the American government to help in the survival of those people. We will be stranglehold from doing that. The crisis in Syria, which I wanted to just make mention of and to ask Dr. Assad, as the Arab League has asked, and as I continue to ask, as my Syrian American neighbors have asked, to step down, which might warrant the United States joining with people of goodwill to help the Syrian people. We will find ourselves in court for each step of our responsibilities. The oath we take that will be in conflict with the balanced budget amendment as it is presently written by the gentleman from Virginia. By the way, if it is not passed as it is, a long-winded process will generate, and that is, and I assume that it is the same balanced budget amendment on the other body, but this will be a long, protracted process while we continue to languish and not do the people's bidding. I would rather do the people's bidding than I would want to, again, yield to a process that by its very nature is fractured and does not adhere to the Constitution as relates to having control of the purse strings, being able to raise armies, being able to provide for the general welfare of the American people. What are we talking about here? Am I going to have to prosecute a case in the federal courts on the question of the general welfare of the American people when we will be thwarted here on the floor of the House because of the balanced budget amendment? I saw the gentleman. I'm not sure if he was attempting to make a point. I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. And I'm not so sure that many of our distinguished colleagues appreciate that the distinguished gentlelady from Houston was a jurist before she came to the Congress of the United States. And so we heard from the author of the amendment, the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, that a 3/5 requirement would be required by this House, I believe, to raise taxes. Now, unlike the Senate, which has a staggered election process, every 6 years is usually the tenure of a senator, here in the House, members of Congress run every 2 years. Essentially, they're elected a year, then they run a year, then they are elected a year, then they run a year, and I'm just finding it nearly impossible to imagine that in the event that revenues are at a shortfall in the Congress of the United States, that there will ever be a Congress under the 3/5 requirement as spoken of in this amendment that would ever be willing to raise taxes on wealthy Americans in order to help balance the nation's budget or to pay for programs. I mean, the politics of the way in which Congress is elected, that we serve 2 years, that we essentially serve a year, run a year, serve a year, do politics a year, which is a fundamental tenet of our system and the constitutional requirement for the House. It just seems to me that inherent in the idea that somehow this Congress is going to have enough political courage in an election year, which, by the way, is every year for members of Congress, that they're going to be willing to raise taxes in order to help provide for necessary needs of the American people. As a jurist, would the gentlelady please comment on this idea of a 3/5 requirement in order to move revenue through this building?
I don't want to remind the gentleman, I'm looking at a statement that my office brought to my attention that I was on the floor of the House September 22nd, 2004. Let me say that I wasn't on the floor of the House. I was in a markup on a proposed balanced budget amendment, and I had in the markup, Mr. Jackson, an amendment called the Poor Children's Amendment. In achieving a balanced budget, outlays shall not be reduced in a manner that disproportionately affects outlays for education, nutrition, health programs for poor children. That was I called it the Poor Children's Amendment, dated September 22nd, 2004. We were dealing with an amendment at that time. Seems that we've done it over and over again. But I only raise that to say you are very right in your analysis. What that means is that those who would be on the side of saying that we have a crisis either with poor children, with nutrition, with the CHIPS program, Children's Health Insurance Program, which now is merged into our Affordable Care Act, any other programs that deal specifically with the poor. Let me just cite this, 2008, 15.45 million impoverished children in the nation, 20.7% of America's youth. The Kaiser Family Foundation estimates that there are currently 5.6 million Texans living in poverty. We have the most uninsured. What it means is that Congresswoman Jackson Lee would battle it out in the courts. I would leave the floor of the House. I couldn't get the amount increased. And I would challenge the constitutionality of the budget, of the balanced budget amendment. That would be part of my remedy because I couldn't raise up a 3/5 in this body, which is a supermajority of essence, supermajority to do the constitutional right that we have for taxation. The House has the purse strings, and that's a constitutional task. We've now changed that simple majority that has been written by our founding fathers who are building a nation and said in building a nation we don't want to be reckless with spending, but let us have a majority that will allow us to tax ourselves and build a nation. We're now arguing that it'll be 3/5, and as we have made it your point, a constitutional amendment. As you know, that we've gone to courts on the 9th Amendment, the right to privacy. We are presently in the throngs of the amendments dealing with due process, and out of that 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment came the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Civil Rights of 1964. That generates court action. To your point, we will be in court, but I would say this. We will be in court on defense matters as well. And let me just indicate a point about defense. In order to spend more than has been appropriated, agencies tasked with defense and national security will need approval from Congress. This increased reliance on emergency appropriations will have detrimental effects on the sound functioning of our defense and national security institutions. The more these institutions are forced to rely on emergency funding, the more unpredictable these budgets will become. This legislation would allow a military conflict or threat to national security to take the budget out of balance. However, in order to authorize additional funds for military engagement or threats to national security that require action, Congress would need to pass legislation citing a specific amount. So the gentleman who was on the floor is very accurate in what the balanced budget amendment will do is kick us off budget if we have an emergency. And might I just say, as my voice is coming to somewhat of a raspy end, might I also say that in addition to being off budget for this Congress, those of us, I see the good speaker, a dear friend from Texas, those of us who are familiar with state budgets, we know that there is a capital budget. And we don't have one here in the federal government. And so we spend, if people would know, monies out of the federal government to ensure the infrastructure of America. Just a few days ago, Texas had articles talking about our water level. Our water is a lifeline for our ranchers. and something has to be done. I expect the legislature will dig deep to address the diminishing water sources and the water shelf that we have to deal with in places where we have to keep our ranchers going. By the way, ranchers of Texas, I love you, and I am proud to be from Texas, where ranching still goes on. You hold on. We have to deal with it as a federal proposition to deal with water all over America. So all of this would be kicked off budget, and I would hope maybe my Texas colleagues would be in the courts with me when they would be denied the right to secure federal funding to help Texas, that is now suffering from enormous deprivation of water because of the drought that we had and some problems that come about through Mother Nature. May I pause for a moment and ask the Speaker as much time remaining?
28 minutes remain.
Then let me just add a few more points to my commentary on this. Let me just say in my district, Texas, more than 190,000 people live below the poverty line. And I want to take Mr. Jackson's comments. I will say that he took the words out of our collective mouths in the Congressional Progressive Caucus that this issue of poverty is really unspoken, but is in need of raising the ante, and it's the highest rate in 17 years. The thresholds proposed in HJRES 2 are completely unrealistic. Even during Ronald Reagan's presidency, before the baby boomers had reached retirement age, swelling the population eligible for Social Security and Medicare when health care costs were lower, federal spending averaged 22% of GDP. We don't have that low number that was offered in the Judiciary Committee, but it is unrealistic as this country grows. My friends, the country has gotten larger. We can't have the same percentages that we had under President Eisenhower. Only 5 years in the last 50 has the federal government posted an annual budget surplus. All other years the government has been in a deficit. We must contain it and restrain it. We must raise money. But we can do that. We've just got to move the various ghosts of tax pledges and other third-party restraints away from the halls of Congress and move the blocker of doing intelligent work, and that would be a balanced budget amendment. And so I believe it is crucial, as this debate goes forward, that we understand the Constitution and the American people understand that you pass a balanced budget amendment and you give up the vote that you cherish every 2 years when you vote for a member of Congress who are allowed to vote for or against, who will stand on the floor of the House and advocate under the Constitution of the United States the authority of this House of Representatives to institute taxes through the discourse of debate and the appropriate use of those taxes to raise up the general welfare of the American government and people. With that in mind, I would beseech of you, as I close, to be able to truly understand the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. Allow me to read this to the record. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do obtain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America. I beg of you, my colleagues who will vote tomorrow, have this Constitution in your hand. Posterity can come through the reasonable work. Posterity can come through the thanking of the Super Committee for its work, and moving beyond the Super Committee into 2012, begin to analyze the needs of the American people and vote for revenue and vote for belt tightening. Don't take the Constitution and shred it tomorrow, voting for a balanced budget amendment that no founding father saw fit to implement, and throwing America's children, veterans, returning soldiers, seniors into the courthouses, the federal courthouses of America, and depending upon the federal court system for justice. We can do justice tomorrow. We can join with the Congressional Progressive Caucus long range, but we can do justice tomorrow and reject the balanced budget amendment on behalf of the constitutional rights of the people and on behalf of the people of the United States of America. I'm happy to yield control of the remaining time to the gentleman from Illinois.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Chairman, may I inquire of the Speaker how much time remains in the first Democratic hour?
The gentleman will have 25 minutes. Will the gentleman suspend?
I will be happy to suspend, Mr. Speaker.
The chair lays before the House an enrolled bill.
H.R. 2112, an act making consolidated appropriations for the Departments of Agriculture, Commerce, Justice, Transportation, and Housing and Urban Development, and related programs for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Jackson, is recognized for the remainder of the hour as a designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the course of this session of Congress, I've given a number of special order speeches in order to get across to this body the basic needs of the American people and how the Constitution is the best means of meeting those needs. In April, I came to the floor and denounced a balanced budget amendment as the end of progress in our society. It would appear that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle didn't pay close attention. Perhaps, as they often do, they blatantly ignored what I believe was the logic and the reason behind my arguments. Either way, Mr. Speaker, here we are, just a few months from my original statement against the BBA, and the House leadership has brought a balanced budget amendment to the floor. This week we'll cast our votes on what Ezra Klein referred to in the Washington Post as, and I quote, "the worst idea in Washington," unquote. In a New York Times editorial published on July 4th, the dangers of the balanced budget amendment are laid out in plain English. No frills, none of the rhetoric that our constituents fall prey to. As simple as the BBA sounds, requiring the federal government to balance its books every year would be like, and I quote, telling families they cannot take out a mortgage or a car loan or do any other kind of borrowing, no matter how sensible the purchase or how creditworthy they may be. Worse than just balancing our budget, the amendments that we'll see in the coming weeks will force a supermajority to approve any borrowing to finance spending and cap all spending at under 20% of GDP. Additionally, two-thirds majority would be required to raise taxes, making that process effectively impossible. Sometimes a meaningful investment leads to greater returns in the long run. The average American can't afford to purchase a car, a house, or an education outright. They need a loan or some arrangement in which they owe money. They might be expected to pay installments at a later date, but the product of that loan could get them to a job interview, in a house, or in a university. A car could get them home after a long night at the office. A car lets them purchase groceries and in turn contribute to the success of the car industry. A house provides safety and security for one's family. An education adds to the quality of a person's life and the betterment of society. A loan may not always be the most desirable situation, but no one would deny its necessity. The chief argument used to sway forlorn Americans to the misguided belief that a BBA would benefit our nation is this: each and every home has to balance its checkbook every month. So why shouldn't our federal government do the same? First of all, let me be clear. You cannot compare the budget of the government of the United States to the budget of a household. It's simply not realistic. Aside from that critical flaw, the truth is that while each and every American home must balance its bank account, this doesn't include the mortgage, the car note, or the car loans that haven't been paid back yet. A true balanced budget is unrealistic in almost any scenario. Lest my words again fall on deaf ears, Mr. Speaker, let's start at the beginning. For my colleagues who did not hear me the first time, this may be a little bit redundant, but I'd like to address the history of the balanced budget amendment. It's been a long time, Mr. Speaker. If I weren't so appalled by the nature of this effort, I'd be apt to congratulate my friends across the aisle for never letting go of their dream. I can absolutely relate, as I have a few constitutional amendments myself. I guess the Disney phrase, quote, "anything can happen when you believe," really did stick with them. They believed since 1936, when in reaction to FDR's New Deal, Republican Congressman Harold Knudsen of Minnesota introduced the first version of the amendment in 1936. Like many constitutional amendments, this resolution did not receive a hearing or a vote. During President Dwight D. Eisenhower's first term, the Judiciary Committee of a barely Democratic Senate held its first hearing on this amendment. It again did not receive a vote. After these partial defeats, the BBA supporters shifted their focus to the states. From 1975 to 1980, 30 state legislatures passed resolutions calling for a constitutional convention to propose this amendment directly to the states. The election of President Ronald Reagan and a Republican Senate in 1980 renewed hopes for the balanced budget amendment and passed by Congress. While the Senate did adopt the amendment in 1982, it failed to garner the necessary two-thirds majority in the House. This failure energized conservative groups such as the National Taxpayers Union and the National Tax Limitations Committee to refocus on state action. In 1982 and 1983, the Alaska and Missouri legislatures passed resolutions supporting the BBA, bringing the total number of these resolutions to 32, too short of the 34 needed for a convention. However, a growing concern about the scope of a constitutional convention led some states to withdraw their resolutions, reshifting focus to congressional action. From 1990 to 1994, Congress would make 3 additional attempts to codify this amendment. All failed to garner the necessary two-thirds majority. However, the BBA made a comeback when it was included in former Speaker Newt Gingrich's contract with America. 26 days after taking office, the newly empowered Republican majority adopted the BBA, giving conservatives their first congressional win in a decade. Disappointment awaited in the Senate, however, where 2 separate votes fell short of its adoption. This failure, along with the balanced budget and the balanced budget surplus at the decade's end, sapped any remaining congressional support for the BBA. There was renewed Republican support for the amendment in 2000 as it was included in the party's platform. The Bush tax cuts, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the passage of Medicare Part D, all unpaid for, led to massive deficit spending by Republicans that eventually led them to swap the balanced budget amendment back under the rug. In fact, I meant to say sweep it back under the rug. By 2004, the Republican Party had created such debt and was so embarrassed that they left any mention of a balanced budget amendment out of their platform. Again in recent years, with the advent of the Tea Party and the return of extreme fiscal conservatism in the Republican Party, there are currently 12 balanced budget amendments in the House and 3 in the Senate. Mr. Speaker, we have a troubling national debt and deficit, but the balanced budget amendment is not the solution. I've already addressed for you the chief arguments that proponents of the BBA use to draw in more misinformed worshipers of flawed austerity, comparisons to everyday families. In the same vein of bandwagon fallacies, my colleagues across the aisle have consistently pointed to another entity that is required to balance its books, the states. Mr. Speaker, I again can't continue without pointing out a serious dilemma in comparing the governments of individual states to the federal government. Perhaps if our founding fathers had seen fit to stick with the Articles of Confederation, this argument might be more legitimate. But at the end of the day, we instead find ourselves under the guidance of the Constitution of the United States, by which I'm able to stand here before you tonight as an elected official conveying the views of my constituents. The requirements and expectations of our federal government, to the great and continuous dismay of some of my colleagues, are now and forever different from those of the states. That the federal government is bound to protect via military force and provide for the collective security of our nation, maintain the national currency, determine the scope of the federal courts, promote and encourage our nation's scientific and technological advancements via patents, and even regulate trade between the states that make up this great union. At the end of the day, the states rely on the federal government much like the citizens of the United States. Alas, Mr. Speaker, since this logic doesn't seem to carry with my conservative friends, I would like to point out a few technical problems with this impressively mature, the states do it argument. On its face, I'm willing to say this may be true. Nearly every state in the Union has some form of a balanced budget requirement. Unfortunately, however, this has not kept them out of debt. Furthermore, their amendments have restricted their ability to care for their citizens in times of austerity or emergency. Quite frankly, I don't think that's an option for the federal government. In the face of such an emergency, I think every constituent we represent would agree. According to a Forbes analysis of the global debt crisis in January of 2010, every single state in the country is carrying some form of debt. These debts range from as little as $17 per capita in Nebraska to $4,490 in Connecticut. In fiscal year 2012, approximately 44 states will face revenue shortfalls. Many are desperately looking for ways to declare their state bankrupt. Bankrupt, I say it again, Mr. Speaker, because this proposed amendment would place the federal government in an equally unacceptable predicament. For instance, in Rhode Island, judges and court workers have cut pay and left 53 positions unfilled. This is still not enough to balance their budget. As a desperate last resort, the Chief Justice has begun to dispose of cases on backlog. Literally, the judge is tossing them out. Florida is in the same predicament. This past week, I spoke to the federal courts in the Northern District of Illinois, federal workers being laid off and furloughed, and men and women who have pensions and long investments in this system being told that the federal courts in the Northern District of Illinois can no longer sustain themselves. I told them I would bring their message back to this Congress, that this Congress can spend billions of dollars to fight a war in Afghanistan and Iraq. We can spend billions of dollars on scientific exploration. We can spend billions of dollars to put a man on the moon. Why can't we find the money in this Congress to put a man or a woman on their own 2 feet right here in America? My colleagues across the aisle are so concerned about handing our children and grandchildren any amount of national debt that they fail to realize we are setting future generations up for failure. States are already cutting too many services that make the American workforce strong and competitive. Should the federal government do the same, our legacy will be an America that is undereducated, ill-equipped to compete on a global level. What happens to America when both state and federal governments can't make the investments in the education our youth need to compete at the global level? When our state and national capitals are both hiding behind balanced budget amendments, what happens to America? The ones who will suffer won't be the conservatives pushing for this amendment. It will be our poor, our children, our veterans, our elderly, the disabled. The America that doesn't have an interest in corporate tax rates, subsidies for big oil companies, or whether the federal government or insurance company underwrites their flood insurance. Everyday America will suffer. The balanced budget amendment is the wrong key to the doors of prosperity. It fits inside the keyhole. It seems like a perfect match, but it really doesn't open the door. We twist it, we shake it, we fiddle with it, but wind up stripping the lock, doing more harm than good. And at the end of the day, we've moved no further, made no progress from where we started. A BBA is not going to solve America's deficit crisis. According to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, Citizens of Tax Justice and others, a federal balanced budget amendment would damage our economy by making recessions deeper and more frequent, heighten the risk of default and jeopardize the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, lead to reductions in needed investments in the future, favor wealthy Americans over middle and low-income Americans by making it far more difficult to raise revenues and easier to cut programs. It would weaken the principle of majority rule, making balancing the budget more difficult. And no one, to my satisfaction, not on the Democratic side and not on the Republican side, has explained to me yet what qualifies a federal judge to intervene in this budget process and make a judgment about what programs to cut. Do they have degrees in economics? Have they studied programs? Have they studied the needs of constituents around the country? Have they been to Appalachia? Have they been to the barrios, the ghettos, and the trailer parks of our nation? What qualifies a federal judge to determine when someone's benefit or assistance should not be given to them? Nothing qualifies them, and yet this Congress votes tomorrow to change the Constitution of the United States as if their opinion should matter in this particular process. Mr. Speaker, I want to go into a little bit more detail about these faults because I need my colleagues to understand the level of damage they'll cause if they continue to sugar this pill and force it down the throats of the American people. First, a balanced budget amendment would damage the economy and make recessions deeper and more frequent. Under a BBA, Congress would be forced to adopt a rigid fiscal policy, requiring the budget to be balanced or in surplus every year, regardless of the current economic situation or threat to the nation's security. A sluggish economy with less revenue and more outgoing expenditures creates a deficit. As we've seen from recent events, a deficit necessitates economic stimulation in order to reverse negative growth. This is why in the last session of Congress, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act invested in roads, bridges, mass transit, and other infrastructure. It provided 95% of working Americans with an immediate tax cut, extended unemployed insurance, and COBRA for Americans hurt by the economic downturn through no fault of their own. If Congress were forced to function under a BBA, deficit reduction would be mandated, even more so during periods of slow or stalled economic growth, which is the opposite of what is needed in this situation. My Republican colleagues have taken to finger-pointing about the stimulus package. Every day I see a commercial laughing about the embarrassing and painful ways it failed to push our economy out of recession. I find it funny that no one has talked about what would have happened without it. Here in the halls of Congress, we're expected to legislate on a vast number of issues, but we always try to take our advice from the experts. And the experts, the economists, told us we should have done more. The BBA risks making the nation's recessions more common and more catastrophic for middle-class families, seniors, veterans, the disabled, the poor. Under such an amendment, Congress is stripped of any power to adequately respond. Secondly, a BBA would risk default and jeopardize the full faith and credit of the United States. We've already been down this road. We already know how dangerous that turn really is. In August, we teetered on the brink of default, playing political games and pointing fingers. We couldn't pass a respectable debt ceiling increase, and we only needed a simple majority to do so. A balanced budget amendment would bar the government from borrowing funds unless a 3/5 vote in both houses of Congress permitted a raise in the debt limit. Under such a scenario, we wouldn't have been able to raise the debt limit in the last debate. A budget crisis in which a default becomes a threat is more likely, and because of the limits placed on the fluidity of the debt ceiling, that default becomes more likely to occur. After the chaos we just experienced, a few short months ago, after the downgrade of our nation's credit rating, not because of our debt, but because of our lack of ability to lead and govern, I would think, Mr. Speaker, that would try to avoid an identical future situation. A BBA would exacerbate the same issues we saw in the August debt ceiling debacle. Third, Mr. Speaker, a BBA would lead to reductions in needed investments for the future. Since the 1930s, our nation has consistently made public investments that improve long-term productivity and growth in education, infrastructure, research, and development. These efforts encourage increased private sector investment, leading to budget surpluses and a thriving economy. A balanced budget amendment, which requires a balanced budget each and every year, would limit the government's ability to make public investments, thereby hindering future growth. For years, conservatives have abused the debt and the deficit as a springboard from which to argue for smaller government and cuts to programs that serve as social safety nets to the American families. Although we must consider the debt and deficit, the larger and more significant issue is the nature of the debt and what it created. If you invest $50,000 in a business, a house, or in an education, you can expect future returns on your investment. If you invest the same $50,000 in a gambling debt, what is the future return? Both expenditures result in a $50,000 debt, but only one results in a return that can transform that debt into a long-term asset or gain. Social investments provide the potential for greater returns in the long run in the same fashion as personal investments. Even small expenditures on social programs lay a foundation for great wealth in the long term. If the nation chose to invest over a 5-year period $1.5 trillion in building roads and bridges and airports and railroads, mass transits, schools, housing, health care, we would create a debt. But the increased ability of companies to interact and ship their goods over well-paved and planned roads, the new businesses that would sprout around freshly built or newly expanded airports, the high wages of a student who was well-educated and able to attend college, resulting in more tax revenue, the improved productivity of employees at their healthiest would eventually result in greater returns for our country. The extension of Bush-era tax cuts for corporations and the rich brought about some short-term stimulus for consumer spending, but similar to the Reagan tax cuts, which resulted in record government deficits and debt, the long-term damage outweighs the immediate effects. Reagan's tax cuts for the rich came at the expense of investing in our nation's need for long-term balanced economic growth. The Reagan administration neglected and cut back our nation's investment in infrastructure, education, health care, housing, job training, transportation, energy conservation, and more. The inclination of most conservatives in both parties, I'm not picking on Republicans today, in both parties, is to cut the debt by cutting programs for the most vulnerable amongst us, our poor, our children, our elderly, our disabled, and minorities. This approach, however, has proven false too many times. A balanced budget amendment would take us back to this archaic and ineffective system permanently. And fourth, Mr. Speaker, a balanced budget amendment favors wealthy Americans over middle and low-income Americans by making it harder to raise revenue and easier to cut programs. Under current law, legislation can pass by a majority of those present and voting by a recorded vote. The BBA requires that legislation raising taxes must be approved on a roll call vote by a majority of the full membership of both houses. Before I even finish this point, Mr. Speaker, I want to make this point. Look at the super committee. Look at what they're wrestling with. We don't even have a balanced budget amendment. And look who they're targeting. Look at the emphasis of their cuts. So instead of a balanced budget amendment in the Constitution, we already see that Congress is ineffective in light of what we've already passed. Imagine if it were a constitutional requirement. The point is so simple, Mr. Speaker. The BBA would make it harder to cut the deficit by curbing special interest tax breaks of the oil and gas industries and making it easier to reduce programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, veterans benefits, education, environmental programs, and assistance to poor children. Wealthy individuals and corporations receive most of their government benefits in the form of tax entitlements, while low-income and middle-income Americans receive most of their government benefits through programs. As evidenced by the cuts that both parties agreed upon recently, it's far easier to cut social welfare programs than to cut spending on our military or to increase taxes. As long as spending is a political issue, cuts to those programs that assist those with the smallest voice in Washington will always happen first. Raising taxes, the only option to address a budget deficit aside from cutting programs, is already a burdensome issue. The additional requirements of a BBA further complicate the process of raising taxes. This means the richest Americans will likely keep the benefits they receive from our governments via tax cuts. Meanwhile, the poor, they lose their programs that provide them with housing, with food, with health care, and the means to survive. This will further reinforce the growing gap between the rich, the rest of our society, middle class, working poor, and the destitute alike. The BBA insists that the total government expenditures in any year, including those for Social Security benefits, not exceed total revenues collected in that same year, including revenues from Social Security payroll taxes. Thus, the benefits of the baby boomers would have to be financed in full by the taxes of those working and paying into the system then. This undercuts the central reforms of 1983. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the BBA weakens the principle of majority rule and makes balancing the budget much more difficult. Most balanced budget amendments require that unless 3/5 of the members of Congress agree to raise the debt ceiling, the budget must be balanced at all times. They also require that legislation raising taxes must be approved on a roll call vote by a majority of the membership. Mr. Speaker, in no way is this an exhaustive list. I know that my time is up, but this is my second attempt to bring to my conservative friends to their senses. The only parties served by a balanced budget amendment are corporate interests and the wealthy. They seem to be serving instead of everyday working Americans. My answer is no, Mr. Speaker, to the balanced budget amendment tomorrow. My answer is yes. If my colleagues agree, there is no way that they can pass the balanced budget amendment unless we ourselves agree that we must invest, build, and grow this economy and work our way out of this problem as Americans. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Burkle, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, here in Washington we are divided on many issues. But whether we are a Republican or a Democrat, members of Congress recognize the essential role that our hospitals play in our communities. Hospitals provide care for the sick. Their clinics provide essential care to many. They are engaged in important medical research, and teaching hospitals are educating doctors and nurses to provide care for future generations. And in many districts across the country, including mine, New York's 25th Congressional District, our hospitals are our major employers, perhaps the largest single employer a congressional district may have. Mr. Speaker, the healthcare sector constitutes nearly 18% of the United States economy and is one of the more stable portions of our economy. American hospitals employ more than 5.4 million people. And as hospitals and hospital employees buy goods and services from other businesses, they create additional jobs. Their economic impact, Mr. Speaker, is felt throughout the community. Hospitals are a vital part of our local and our national economy. In New York State, and particularly in my home district, hospitals are the largest single employer. I want to call your attention to this chart, Mr. Speaker, with data provided by the Hospital Association of New York, which shows the importance hospitals have on my district's local economy. 5 hospitals in my district employ over 18,000 people. Together, payroll and purchases in my district alone amount to over $2.4 billion. They generate over $100 million in state and local income and sales taxes. This is in my district alone, Mr. Speaker, the economic impact of our hospitals. Looking at New York State as a whole, combined, and I hope some of my New York colleagues will join me here tonight, hospitals contribute nearly $108 billion to our state and our local economies. Mr. Speaker, it is no exaggeration to say hospitals are a mainstay of our New York State economy. And when our hospitals are hurting, Mr. Speaker, the effect extends to the entire community. Our hospitals are under assault, and not only will it affect our local and state economy, but it will also affect access to health care, some of the most basic services that our hospitals provide to our communities. I now yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gingrey.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentlelady from New York for yielding to me. As I think most of my colleagues know, Congresswoman Burkle is a member of the House GOP Doctors Caucus. 21 of us, all health care providers, some doctors, some nurses, some dentists, some psychologists. We've got a really good, diverse group that I would hate to say, Mr. Speaker, the total number of years of clinical experience that we all have in the aggregate, but it's several hundred. I have thoroughly enjoyed having Congresswoman Burkle, a registered nurse who has worked for years in hospitals in the New York area. And as she's pointing out, the 4 hospitals in her district are probably one, if not the major employer, one of the major employers, and so important to her community. the 25th District of New York. That is so true, Mr. Speaker, across so many of our districts. I happen to be an OBGYN physician, having practiced in my congressional district, the 11th of Georgia, for some 26 years. In our hospital system there, the main town in Cobb County, Marietta, Georgia, where we have lived for the last 36 years, just as in Congresswoman Burkle's district, the hospital system is one of the main drivers of the economy, that and the school system, the public school system. But the hospital systems are employers, and we sometimes forget that. I think as a physician, a lot of times I may be guilty of concentrating on issues that mainly affect my colleagues in the medical profession, the practitioners, the MDs. But as Congresswoman Burkle is pointing out, and I know she's got a number of posters and slides for us to look at tonight, the devastating effects that the so-called Affordable Care Act, the Unaffordable Care Act indeed, has on our hospitals, like hers, the 4 hospitals in the 25th of New York, the WellStar health system, and it's, I think, 6 different facilities in the metropolitan Atlanta, Cobb County area. It is devastating. So I really appreciate the opportunity to join with her tonight, along with some of my other colleagues in the House GOP Doctors Caucus, to make sure that people understand that it's not just the doctors and the health providers outside of the hospitals that are suffering because of this Unaffordable Care Act, but our hospital systems all across the nation. I thank the gentlelady for yielding to me, and I plan to be with her during this next hour, and I yield back at this moment.
And I thank the gentleman from Georgia for being here this evening. Mr. Speaker, as my colleague mentioned, the President's Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which became law in March of 2010, included some welcome provisions, such as allowing people to stay on their parents' insurance until the age of 26 and prohibiting insurers from denying coverage based on pre-existing conditions. These positive provisions, which proponents quickly point to when facing criticism, are far outweighed by the negative consequences that the Affordable Care Act has on our providers and the healthcare system. These measures could have been accomplished in a much simpler manner. And I say to you, Mr. Speaker, so many roads are paved with good intentions, but the unintended consequences are devastating to our hospitals. As a healthcare professional, my opposition to the Affordable Care Act has never been solely based on philosophical grounds, but strategic and tactical ones. Most Americans, myself included, my colleagues here in Congress, recognize that health care needs to be reformed, that health care continues, the cost continues to rise, and we need to figure this out. We just disagree what health care reform should look like. If I thought that the federal government could be the necessary agent of change, that would be one thing. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe the government can change health care. Mr. Speaker, the Affordable Care Act affects how our hospitals and our providers, and it's not a Republican or a Democratic issue, but an American one. Access to health care affects every American. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield now to the gentleman from Michigan, Dr. Benechek.
Thank you for the yielding to me. Mr. Speaker, I've spent 28 years as a physician practicing rural medicine, even serving on the board of my local hospital. I'm well aware of the great financial difficulty most rural hospitals and clinics experience each year. Today, I was pleased that the state of Michigan celebrated Rural Health Day. On behalf of the thousands of Michiganders that call small towns and farming communities home, my state's governor chose to recognize the hospitals and community-based centers that provide for the diverse and unique health care needs of these areas. Tonight, I'd like to join the state of Michigan in raising awareness about the importance these providers bring to the communities that I represent. While we recognize the importance of rural health today, I would be remiss if I did not mention one of the great rural health facilities in my district. Many of my colleagues may have visited the Straits of Mackinac during a summer vacation, or perhaps they've seen Mackinac Island featured on a Pure Michigan ad. The Rural Health Clinic in St. Ignace is the single largest employer in the community, supporting not only the local township, but in addition, the 900,000 plus seasonal visitors that depend upon the hospital for services each year. I recently received a distressing letter from Mr. Rodney Nelson, the CEO of Mackinac Straits Health System. Mr. Nelson is very worried about the impact Medicare cuts may have on his patients, employees, and ultimately the ability to keep the doors to the hospital open. Mr. Speaker, the Mackinac Straits Health System is one of the 25 hospitals in my district that are considered either critical access or sole community hospitals. Of these, 56% are already operating in the red. Unlike urban areas, my constituents often do not have another option when seeking health care. In the case of the St. Ignace Hospital, the next closest clinic is 50 miles away. What you may not know, Mr. Speaker, is that caring for patients in rural facilities is far more economic than providing urban care. In fact, rural patients cost less to treat in 8 of the 9 CMS regions. As my colleagues and I discuss possible ways to trim the budget, I feel it's important to remember that without rural hospitals, many of my constituents would not have access to medical care. A 2% reduction in Medicare spending is estimated to cost 389 jobs in my district as a direct result to cuts to rural hospitals. If this number were raised to 10%, the figures would only get worse. At that point, 76% of the hospitals would be operating in the red. And the total economic impact is expected to be nearly $68 million, with 1,900 jobs affected. Mr. Speaker, I don't need to tell anyone that people in northern Michigan can't afford to lose another 1,900 jobs. Mr. Speaker, if we force these cuts, not only will we lose these jobs, we will lose access to many people's sole source for health care. We are forcing rural patients to travel longer distances to seek more expensive care. This just costs everyone more money. I urge my colleagues to exercise caution when considering reductions to Medicare programs, especially those specific to physicians, critical access, and sole community hospitals. I yield back my time.
And I thank the gentleman from Michigan. Mr. Speaker, we've touched upon it, and I want to continue having this conversation about the effect that the Affordable Care Act is going to have on our hospitals and our Medicare population. Now, Mr. Speaker, you may have heard over and over again from our colleagues from the other side of the aisle demagoguing our budget proposal that came out in April. They say we want to kill Medicare, we want to kill Social Security, we don't care about our seniors. Tonight I stand here, Mr. Speaker, and I tell you, and I want to tell the American people, that the Affordable Care Act, in fact, cuts Medicare spending by $500 billion. $500 billion. Those are actual cuts, Mr. Speaker, that are now in the Affordable Care Act, or what is known as the health care law. One of the most negative effects is the result of reductions in hospital Medicare payments and the CMS's code offsetting reductions to hospital payment plans. Now, I have a chart here, Mr. Speaker, and as I go through my notes, I want it to be clear that you can see 2010 and what happens to Medicare reimbursements down until 2018. Our hospitals can't sustain these cuts. And the 5 hospitals in my district have come to me and they said, this Affordable Care Act, and many of these hospitals were big proponents of Affordable Care Act because they know in our country we need to reform our health care system. We need to make some changes. So they were in support of the law. But what they didn't realize was this law is going to cut their Medicare reimbursements, which so many of them depend on, it's the mainstay, by 28.6%. I've had hospitals in my district say to me, We cannot sustain these cuts. We will go bankrupt. Because, you see, Mr. Speaker, it's not only this Medicare, the reduction in these rates, it also is a series of other cuts, which we will get into as the evening proceeds. The gentleman from Georgia, I would yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding to me, and I wanted to take an opportunity, Mr. Speaker. I have an article, actually, in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Atlanta's main newspaper. This was several months ago, referencing one of our best hospitals, Piedmont Healthcare, in the title of the article, Piedmont Healthcare Cutting 5% of Workforce. And this is what Misty Williams of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution says in this op-ed piece. Faced with a rising number of uninsured patients and unknown impact of the new health care law, that would be the so-called Affordable Care Act, Piedmont Healthcare announced Thursday evening, this was 3 months ago, plans to cut 464 jobs as part of an effort to save an estimated $68 million. Totaling roughly 5% of its workforce, the cuts include 171 positions that were vacant or altered because of scheduling changes. Layoffs are coming from across the board, including Piedmont's 4 hospitals, physician groups, Heart Institute, and corporate division, spokeswoman Nina Day said. And I quote Ms. Day, "This is heart-wrenching. This is not easy stuff when you're talking about people." The move is in part a reaction to hurdles and hurdles that Congresswoman Burkle and Congressman Benishek were just talking about. The hurdles that many hospitals are facing, and it includes, yes, a growing number of uninsured patients, a new state hospital bed tax, anticipated cuts to Medicare reimbursements, and the Medicaid expansion in 2014. The article goes on talking more and more about how devastating this would be. And in conclusion, without reading the entire article, I'll finish up and then yield back to my colleague. The last paragraph of this article by Ms. Williams: while hospitals will get more insured patients as a result of the Medicaid expansion in 2014, it's a big trade-off with Medicare cuts. State officials have estimated that Georgia, my state, could add more than 600,000 enrollees to its Medicaid program as a result of this expansion, again, under Obamacare. It's a challenge in time just trying to navigate all of these changes. You know, again, it's just so important that, Mr. Speaker, we're having the opportunity tonight on behalf of our leadership to tell our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Congresswoman Burkle moments ago said it's not a Democrat or a Republican issue. It's a people issue. It's a community issue, and it's devastating. And it's sad news that we're bringing to our colleagues, but we need to do that. And the American people need to understand what's coming. The worst has not yet hit. And I yield back.
And I thank the gentleman from Georgia. You know,